Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Willow had once clung to the fragile hope that marrying Drew would mark the beginning of a more peaceful, healing chapter in her life, a soft reprieve after enduring years of trauma, loss, and emotional turmoil. In her mind, the wedding was supposed to be a symbolic closure of the pain she had weathered and the gateway to something stable, something safe. But that dream dissolved almost as quickly as it had formed, unraveling not in explosive confrontation or scandal, but in a chilling, suffocating silence. It wasn't a moment of betrayal that tore the illusion down, it was a slow, horrifying realization that Drew's kindness had always been conditional, his affection wrapped tightly in veiled control. Beneath the gentle reassurances and promises to protect her, Willow saw something far more sinister. A man who needed her to be broken so he could feel strong, who disguised manipulation as loyalty, and who was more invested in managing her than in loving her. She wanted nothing more than to see Wiley and Amelia, to hold them again and find some piece of herself in their presence. That desire became her lifeline. It was the one thing that kept her moving when everything else had crumbled. And so, with nothing but trembling resolve, she turned to Michael, hoping against hope that he would allow her a path back to motherhood. But that hope was quickly extinguished. Michael, though no longer harboring romantic feelings for Willow, still cared enough to want what was best for their children, and in his eyes, that did not include subjecting them to the instability Willow now embodied. Her mental state was too fragile, too volatile. He didn't doubt her love for Wiley and Amelia, but love was not enough. Not when her grip on reality was tenuous, her emotions so volatile that a single denial could send her spiraling. Michael couldn't take that risk, not after watching her recent breakdowns. So, he said no. Coldly, definitively. He would not allow her access to the children until she was better. Stable. Whole again. That rejection was the final fracture. Already frayed, Willow snapped beneath the weight of it. It wasn't just a denial, it was the shattering of her last illusion that someone still believed in her. She felt betrayed on both sides. By Michael, who had once loved her and now shut the door without remorse, and by Drew, who had vowed to protect her and instead left her vulnerable and adrift. It was in that spiraling, disoriented state that Drew reappeared, not as a comforting presence, but as a manipulative opportunist who recognized the perfect moment to act. He knew she was broken, desperate, willing to grasp at any chance to be with her children again. And he used that knowledge ruthlessly. Drew's offer was deceptively compassionate, wrapped in the language of support. He proposed a plan, a legal strategy that would position Willow as a victim of Michael's emotional gatekeeping. All she had to do was follow his guidance. Trust him. Let him take control of the situation. He painted himself as her advocate, her only hope for regaining custody. And Willow, teetering on the edge of despair, clung to him as if he were a life raft. She didn't see the trap in his outstretched hand. She didn't question the intent behind his sudden willingness to help. She was too far gone, too consumed by grief, and so she said yes. That single word became the first stone in the avalanche of mistakes that would follow. With Drew pulling the strings, Willow began filing petitions and affidavits aimed at dismantling Michael's credibility. At first, she believed the lies they wrote were strategic exaggerations, just enough to sway the court. But soon, those lines blurred. Drew pushed her to submit recordings, photos, and journal entries that had been altered or taken out of context to paint Michael as a negligent, emotionally abusive father. He suggested that if Willow testified to feeling unsafe or alienated, it would add emotional weight to the case. What started as a desperate attempt to see her children morphed into a full-blown character assassination of the man who had once shared a life with her. And through it all, Willow convinced herself it was for the greater good. But deep inside, her conscience was screaming. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger staring back, a woman willing to destroy someone else to satisfy her own emptiness. The guilt twisted inside her like a knife, but she couldn't stop. Drew had tightened his grip, constantly reminding her that she was too unstable to do this on her own, that the system wouldn't believe her unless she leaned on him, followed his lead. Each step forward buried her deeper in a pit of deceit she didn't know how to climb out of. Her identity began to erode beneath the weight of manipulation, and soon, she no longer recognized the choices she was making. She was no longer fighting for her children. She was acting out a script written by someone who wanted to use her pain for his own vendetta. And Drew's vendetta was clear: he wanted to destroy Michael. The jealousy he had long harbored, especially over Michael's unbreakable bond with Wiley, had festered into quiet obsession. Now, with Willow as his pawn, he had the means to attack without ever getting his hands dirty. Willow became the perfect weapon, credible, sympathetic, emotionally wounded. Her mental fragility, once a hindrance, now became a tool in Drew's narrative of victimhood. And while he played the part of the supportive ex-husband publicly, behind closed doors he continued to isolate Willow, ensuring she doubted every other voice but his. What Willow failed to see was that she was becoming collateral damage in a war she never wanted to fight. Her mental health deteriorated rapidly under the stress of legal proceedings, the lies she was forced to maintain, and the increasing fear that she might be caught. Nightmares plagued her sleep. Panic attacks ambushed her in courtrooms and waiting rooms. Carly, who had once welcomed Willow into her family with open arms, began noticing the disturbing changes. Conversations became disjointed, Willow's eyes darted with paranoia, and her once calm demeanor had been replaced with nervous laughter and erratic movements. Eventually, Carly intervened, quietly reaching out to a psychiatrist and documenting the signs she saw. She didn't want to betray Willow, but she also couldn't ignore what was happening. By the time Curtis, too, began voicing his concerns, sharing with Nina and Portia his unease about Drew's behavior and Willow's unraveling, it was already too late. The courts had started asking questions. Reports were filed. And in one devastating courtroom appearance, Willow broke down completely. When asked a simple question about her fitness as a mother, she froze, then collapsed into sobs, muttering incoherently about betrayal, about children she couldn't reach, about being trapped in someone else's game. It was the final straw. The judge ordered a psychological evaluation and, soon after, an emergency admittance to Ferncliffe for her own safety. As she sat alone in that sterile, quiet room, staring at the padded walls and flickering light above, Willow finally began to understand the magnitude of her fall. She had tried to reclaim her life, her family, but instead she had lost herself. And Drew, the man she had once trusted to stand beside her, was nowhere to be found. She had become a shadow, a vessel for someone else's revenge. And now, with nothing left but time and silence, she would have to decide whether she could claw her way back from the damage she had helped create, or whether she had already gone too far to return. Willow's psychological condition deteriorated rapidly as she sank deeper into the chaos orchestrated by Drew. What began as moments of sadness and confusion evolved into a spiral of unrelenting emotional instability. She was plagued by recurring panic attacks that left her breathless and trembling, her mind clouded with fragmented memories and surging waves of irrational fear. The once composed woman who had survived illness, grief, and betrayal was now a shell of herself, drowning in a psychological storm she could no longer navigate. Her perception of reality began to fray, and the emotional wounds inflicted by Drew's manipulation only widened with each passing day. She no longer trusted her instincts, no longer believed in the clarity of her own thoughts. The people she had once leaned on, those who had once given her comfort and unconditional support, began to appear to her as enemies or saboteurs. Even Carly, who had opened her home and heart to Willow like family, became a source of unease in her paranoid, crumbling psyche. Willow began to suspect that Carly was secretly working with Michael to keep her from her children, whispering lies into the ears of judges and doctors. These suspicions consumed her. Every time Michael refused to let her see Wiley or Amelia, it ignited violent, desperate reactions. She would scream through the walls, hurl objects across the room, sobbing uncontrollably until her body gave out from exhaustion. In those moments, she no longer recognized herself. The pain of separation, compounded by mental instability and emotional manipulation, became too much for her to bear. After one particularly explosive episode, she collapsed on the cold floor of her room, surrounded by shattered glass and overturned furniture, the air thick with silence and despair. Carly, shaken and heartbroken by what she witnessed, knew she could no longer remain a bystander. She reached out to medical professionals, reporting what she had seen and pleading for someone to intervene. The psychiatrist who evaluated Willow compiled a detailed psychological report that painted a grim picture: severe emotional dysregulation, paranoia, signs of trauma-induced hallucinations, and deep dissociative episodes. The recommendation was immediate and intensive inpatient treatment. There was no other choice. For Willow's safety, and the safety of those around her, she needed to be placed in a secure mental health facility. That facility was Ferncliffe. Meanwhile, Drew continued to play his role with calculated precision. He portrayed himself to the public and to authorities as Willow's devoted protector, a concerned ex-husband still trying to help a fragile woman recover from the trauma of separation and rejection. But behind closed doors, his tactics shifted. He began to weaponize the very breakdowns he had helped induce, turning Willow's vulnerabilities into leverage. He warned her, in a quiet and sinister tone, that if she defied him or tried to expose their arrangement, he would destroy her. He would show the court evidence of her panic attacks, her erratic behavior, her emotional collapses. He would make sure she never saw her children again. Willow, already teetering on the edge of sanity, found herself trapped in a psychological prison. Every decision, every thought, was colored by fear and shame. Drew had carefully built a cage around her, one without bars, but with threats and guilt that were just as confining. She was manipulated into silence, convinced that any act of defiance would result in complete and permanent isolation from her children. The hope that had once fueled her strength was now a weakness Drew exploited. Her longing to be a mother again, once pure and powerful, had become the very chain that bound her to him. Over time, her identity eroded. The woman who had once stood bravely against leukemia, who had advocated fiercely for her son, who had once chosen integrity over comfort, was disappearing. In her place was someone who mumbled through legal meetings, stared blankly through courtroom sessions, and nodded obediently at Drew's every suggestion. The fire in her eyes had dimmed. She was no longer Willow, she was Drew's echo, performing a role she didn't even remember agreeing to. Curtis, watching from the sidelines, began to notice the dissonance. Having once been close to Drew, he recognized patterns, subtle ones, of control and gaslighting. Drew's seemingly altruistic behavior was too polished, too rehearsed. Curtis noted the way Drew answered questions for Willow during conversations, the way he intercepted her phone calls, the way Willow flinched ever so slightly when his tone sharpened. Concerned, he brought his observations to Nina and Portia, both of whom had also started to see changes in Willow's demeanor. Together, they began quietly collecting evidence, watching as the situation grew more dangerous by the day. Michael, too, felt something was deeply wrong. Though he had stepped away from Willow for the sake of his children, he had not stopped caring. He began to scrutinize the custody filings that continued to arrive at his lawyer's desk. Each petition seemed more aggressive than the last, filled with legal jargon, carefully constructed narratives, and strategically placed accusations. The pace at which the documents were being filed, their tone, the sheer polish of every detail, it didn't match Willow's usual behavior. It was too exact. Too weaponized. Michael had known Willow long enough to understand when she was thinking with her heart, and when she was acting under pressure. This wasn't her voice on paper, it was someone else's. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, Michael began pulling back from his position of neutrality. He reached out to Curtis and Carly, sharing what he suspected, that Drew was behind the legal blitz, using Willow's desperation and deteriorating condition to wage a quiet war over the children. As the three compared notes, a clearer picture emerged, one of systematic manipulation, psychological warfare, and emotional abuse disguised as concern. But by then, Willow was no longer in any condition to speak for herself. Isolated in Ferncliffe, surrounded by strangers and haunted by memories that no longer felt like her own, she drifted through days in a haze of sedation and therapy. Her doctors noted that while she was responsive, her progress was slow, impeded by fear and a lingering belief that any wrong word would be used against her. It would take weeks, if not months, for her to even begin trusting the people trying to help her. Still, buried beneath the layers of trauma and confusion, there remained a flicker of the old Willow. Somewhere inside, she remembered who she was, who she used to be before the manipulation, before the breakdown. Whether that flicker would survive, whether it would grow into something stronger, depended on one thing: whether the truth about Drew's role in her unraveling could be brought into the light, and whether Willow would be able to reclaim her voice before it was silenced forever. Inside the walls of Ferncliffe, surrounded by sterile halls and the mechanical rhythm of institutional life, Willow began a journey she never could have anticipated. One of agonizing introspection, fragile awakening, and the slow climb out of a psychological abyss. Her days were structured and monitored, her nights heavy with silence and restless thoughts. The initial shock of being institutionalized, of being stripped of autonomy, her possessions reduced to state-issued clothes and a numbered file, was overwhelming. At first, Willow resisted everything: therapy, medication, conversation. She sat still for hours, silent in group sessions, her eyes glazed and unresponsive. The weight of humiliation clung to her, pressing against her chest like a vice. She replayed her courtroom breakdown over and over again, her trembling hands, the chaos in her voice, the way the room seemed to blur as she collapsed under the gaze of strangers who no longer saw her as a mother, but as a cautionary tale. In those early days, Willow retreated into herself, folding her identity around shame. Her thoughts were consumed by the realization that she had failed on every front: as a mother, as a partner, as a woman who had once believed herself strong enough to weather anything. She no longer knew who she was. The reflection that stared back at her in the metal bathroom mirror was pale, gaunt, and void of life. Her hair, once brushed with care, hung limp. Her hands, once so steady when cradling her children, now shook even as she tried to hold a cup of tea. She felt haunted. By memories, by regrets, by the lingering ghost of Drew's voice whispering that she was too broken to survive without him. Yet amid the monotony of the institution, in between the monotone medication schedules and the quiet shuffle of patients to and from therapy, something subtle began to shift. A therapist, an older woman named Dr. Hastings, took a particular interest in Willow. She didn't push. She didn't demand. She simply sat with her, day after day, sometimes in silence, sometimes offering gentle questions, always making it clear that there was no judgment in her presence. And slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Willow began to talk. At first, it was in fragments, disjointed memories of Michael's cold stare, of Wiley's little fingers grasping hers, of the way Amelia used to fall asleep with her hand curled under her mother's chin. Then the words became longer, fuller. She spoke of the fear that had taken root inside her, how she had begun to believe that everyone was against her, how Drew's voice had seemed like the only one telling her what to do. She admitted she didn't know if her actions had been right or wrong, only that she had been desperate to be a mother again, and desperation had blurred her boundaries, warped her sense of self. Dr. Hastings didn't offer easy answers. But she did offer validation. She helped Willow see that her trauma had not begun with Drew, but with years of emotional suppression, of fighting her illness alone, of enduring losses she never properly grieved. The grief of losing her biological son. The fear of her diagnosis. The pressure of being a good mother even while breaking inside. Drew hadn't created her fragility, he had only exploited it. That realization hurt more than anything else. Willow had willingly given her power to someone who saw her pain not as something to heal, but as something to control. She started journaling again, pages upon pages filled with sorrow, confusion, and emerging clarity. She apologized to the nurses when her anxiety snapped at them. She asked questions during group therapy. She began requesting books on healing, on motherhood, on recovery. She read voraciously, her mind hungry for knowledge, for guidance, for a roadmap back to herself. And most of all, she began to rebuild her relationship with her children in her mind. She would sit by the window, watching the gray sky beyond the barred glass, and imagine reading to Wiley again, brushing Amelia's hair, taking them to the park. Not because she wanted to return to the past, but because she believed that even if she couldn't undo her mistakes, she could become someone they deserved, someone stable, strong, and whole. She stopped fantasizing about revenge, about forcing Michael to relent, about manipulating the system. She let go of the dream that Drew would change, or that he would ever admit the damage he caused. Instead, she turned inward, and in doing so, began reclaiming her own narrative.